Alright guys, here it is, the video. Well, this one's a little different. Today we're going to be handling the origin of language, and a really common misconception. This is a PSA, okay? This is a PSA. A really common misconception about human language, the origin of human language, and the nature of animal communication in general, right? I get into a lot of discussions online, which I, either intentionally or unintentionally, slide into discussions about anthropology and linguistics, which is sort of the thing I like to talk about. And, inevitably, this comes back to the origin of language. It's something about it. Every discussion will lead back to the origin of language when you put me as a speaker. And, the origin of language is notoriously sort of competitive as a field, as a question. It's well remembered that in 1866, the French Academy for the Sciences banned discussion of the origin of language. So this is like an almost 160-year-old problem at the very, very youngest that people have been pretty competitive with each other about. So, why all the competition? Well, I think I get it now. I think I get it because I'm starting to get kind of heated. That's why this is a PSA. Because, when you hear people, I mean, this is especially common among people who don't have all that much training in anthropology or linguistics. I think the group that do this the most are people who have training in academia, but specifically not anthropology or linguistics, which says a little bit about academia. And this misconception, this common error, is the idea that animal communication is basically a shared trait between species, right? That just like we can look at different animals' tailbones to analyze when, the phylogenetic tree branches off, that we can analyze animal communication mechanisms and therefore tease out aspects of our language, or tease out aspects of their language, or the underlying structure or purpose of communication, right? And this is a pretty common misconception. So I'm going to go over why formally this is wrong, but I'm going to preempt the response that these people tend to think supersedes any of the positions that I'll put forth, and that response is, but, X other animal, they also have language, as well as us, right? Say orcas, but orcas have language like we do. Dolphins have language like we do, or bees, or birds, or chimps, or something like that have language like we do. This is mostly, misremembered pseudoscience, like all your cells are replaced, 99% of your cells are replaced in 7 years, or whatever that is. It's like that category of scientific knowledge, pop science, that's only ever half remembered, and then, incorrectly regurgitated. But, It is mostly in the realm of pop science. It is mostly these pop science distributors that are publishing things saying that dolphin and human communication are structurally the same, and we might be able to bridge the gap one day and translate dolphin to human, which is nonsense. And it leads me into the first proposal, pretty much the easiest, most academically linguistic response to this, which is their languages do not have productivity. And the point I'm going to make is pretty boring here, but even the most advanced animal communication mechanisms, those of birds, those of orcas, they don't have what's called productivity. They don't have recursion, specifically. And what that means is, I'll give an example of recursion and you'll kind of get what I mean. In English, we can say, I see Sally. And then we can continue that and say, I see Sally sees me. And then I see Sally sees me see Sally. And we can continue that pattern forever, right? So, hypothetically, we know from that example, English has infinitely many sentences. I can continue that forever, and each sentence has a different kind of meaning. It's not just an alias for a more basic sentence. It is really, we have an infinite amount of possible sentences and possible meanings that can be expressed in our language. And interestingly, that's not unique to English, it's not unique to the Germanic languages, it's not unique to the Indo-European languages. It's shared by every human language. Every human language has recursion and productivity. There was one proposal of a Brazilian language called Pirahã, which breaks a lot of rules, I admit, that people were saying didn't have recursion for a while back in the day. But it does, right? So we've discovered every human language has recursion. All of the 4,000 languages that we've analyzed, of the 7,000 that exist, they all have recursion. If they didn't, you revealed that, you would be lauded as one of the most important linguists, scientists, anthropologists, what have you, of the century. You'd be like the new Noam Chomsky if you could show that recursion was not a part of language. So this is a big thing. for human languages, and it extends as perfectly, as completely to the set of animal languages as it does for human languages, just in the inverse. There are no animal communication systems that come even close to productivity or recursion. It's really, really difficult to prove productivity in the abstract, but recursion's not that difficult to observe. Recursion has pretty particular patterns, particular entropic patterns that you can identify in animal speech. And there have been found no animal languages, no animal communication mechanisms, that's what I should call them, animal communication mechanisms, which exhibit that productivity or that recursion. And this is pretty huge. I mean, recursion's like it's a very big part of our communication. Just conceptually, it reflects the fact that our structure of language is really prototypically different from every other animal. It's not just that one factor. It's not just the capacity to say infinitely many things. It's how that reflects on our syntax as human speakers, as human language users, and that syntax permits for this kind of thing. It's rule-based syntax, basically, which there's no reason to think animal language is. If it's rule-based, it's probably biologically encoded, and even then, there's no evidence of the sort of rule-based analysis that we use in our syntax, because we would expect, if there were a relatively context-free set of rules, that we would have infinite productivity, we would have infinitely many sentences, we would have recursion, right? So there's good reason to think that no animals have the productivity, recursion, or underlying syntactic structure that a human language has, right? And furthermore, you know, this is pregnant with a lot of other misconceptions, like that language is just social and not biological at all, which isn't true. Chomsky has discovered that conclusively. And this is not just... one of the things that irks me about this whole misconception, it's not just a low-level Discord debate server position to take, it's... I heard my sophomore year biology teacher in high school say this, so this is a very wide misconception. And, yeah, it's definitely worth going over, because it has important consequences, and we'll see what the consequences are when I contrast a lot of these worldviews with generative anthropology. But for a moment, let's take a divergence. Let's look at probably the most important linguist of all time, Noam Chomsky. Right? I found this interview with Noam Chomsky and this guy called what's his name? His name is Cucchiaro. Great name. And he's talking about, you know, a lot of things, but the main thrust of the discussion is about animals mimicking human speech, animals learning human speech, specifically one case of an imp called Nim Chimpsky, obviously based off Noam Chomsky, that was, people would try to teach them ASL. This pretty well-regarded group of researchers tried to teach this chimp to use ASL. Right? And Noam Chomsky, you know, he lets out his thoughts on animals mimicking human speech, right? I mean, and for the record, if animals could mimic human speech, that would definitely mean that they had those syntactic structures with productivity, with recursion, which they don't. And if they had those syntactic structures with productivity and recursion, they would definitely be able to reproduce large swaths of human syntactic speech, right? Neither have been found to be true, not in either direction. And let's look through this little discussion that Cucchiaro has with Chomsky talking about that book and Chomsky's thoughts on it. So Cucchiaro says, "There's a recent book out called Nim Chimpsky chronicling the project in the 1970s where researchers were trying to disprove your theory that language is exclusively a human attribute. It's an interesting read." In response, Chomsky says, "The experiment was carried out by a very serious experimental psychologist, Herbert Terrace, a convinced Skinnerian, which is a student of the behaviorist B.F. Skinner. He expected that if an ape was brought up just like a human, it would be a little human. He had some very fine assistants, including some excellent former students of ours and others who went on to be leading figures in the field. The experimentation was done with meticulous care. There's a book called Nim, which describes it with great enthusiasm, claiming at the end that it was a grand success and the ape is ready to go on to do great things. Then comes the epilogue. When the experiment was over, a grad student working on a thesis did a frame-by-frame analysis of the training and found that the ape was no dope. If he wanted a banana, he'd produce a sequence of irrelevant signs and throw in the sign for banana randomly, figuring that he'd brainwashed the experimenters sufficiently so that they'd think he was saying, 'Give me a banana.' And he was able to pick out subtle motions by which the experimenters indicated what they'd hope he'd do. Final result? Exactly what any sane biologist would have assumed, 0. So this is really interesting, right? By the way, if an ape could be demonstrated to reproduce human language perfectly, I think that would say a lot. I think it would say a lot about the structure of human language, and it would imply that our language might be branched off from other animals. It might just be a long held genetic continuum of animal communication mechanisms, of which our linguistic faculty is just one branch, is just one derivation. But there's really conclusive evidence that that is not the case. And, I mean, this is a specifically kind of funny case because, you know, these really smart researchers, these really accomplished academics got outsmarted by a primate. But, it's pretty interesting because it means this animal, which is, like, the most similar to us, they're not the best at language or linguistic manipulation, but chimps are pretty similar to us. They were not able to come close to reproducing human language. All they did is ASL sign specific words like banana, which is not difficult to do. Almost every animal that's social can do that to some extent. Perhaps they'd have trouble using words like soul or accelerate, but they would definitely be able to say banana, right? So this goes on, this kind of like continues. People have tried to teach birds language. People have tried to learn dolphin language. It never really comes to fruition since, I mean, this has been a field of research since the 70s. The way you know it's never come to fruition is that if it did, it would have such huge implications that they would definitely be in the upper echelons of science for the rest of their life, and you would have definitely heard about them. So, at the very least, we get from this, I've made my point, okay, animal languages definitely don't have recursion and productivity. Animal language faculties, if there's such an analog, do not have the same capacities that ours do, so they're definitely different. No animal comes close to us in that sense. But hey, maybe the origin of our language is in a common genetic trait passed down from our primate ancestors that they just have an underdeveloped form of, you know? This is kind of like the common liberal conception of how language came about and how it works. It's just, well, we're smart monkeys, so we made language because we're smart. That's what you do when you have language. Or, you know, better formulated, maybe there's this common animal system of signing, of communication that was passed down to us, and with our superior intellect, we just added stuff like recursion. Maybe they would propose that's why it's so different. Now, that's off the mistaken assumption that recursion is the only difference, or that recursion is indicative not of a fundamental structural change to our syntax, which is what it really is, but instead just one feature of a common animal communication syntax, which it is not. But even if we entertain that that's a theory, let's see what Chomsky says about, you know, this more broadly. He says elsewhere in this interview that it's all totally meaningless with reference to animals mimicking human speech, so I don't participate in the debate. Humans can be taught to do a fair imitation of the complex bee communication system, right? That is not of the slightest interest to bee scientists, who are rational and understand something about science. They're interested in the nature of bees, and it is of no interest if some other organism can be trained to partially mimic some superficial aspects of the waggle dance. And one could, of course, not get a grant to teach grad students to behave like imperfect bees. When we turn to the study of humans, for some reason irrationality commonly prevails, possibly a reflection of old-fashioned dualism, and it is considered significant that apes, or birds, which tend to do much better, can be trained to mimic some superficial aspects of human language. But the same rational criteria should hold as in the case of bees and graduate students. Possibly training graduate students to mimic the waggle dance could teach us something about human capacity, though it's unlikely. Similarly, it's possible that training apes to do things with signs can teach us something about the cognitive capacities of apes. That's the way the matter is approached by serious scientists like Anne and David Premack. Others prefer to fool themselves. We would learn nothing about apes from the fact that grad students could be trained to more or less mimic them. Try to get an NSF contract to study that. Just as we learn nothing about humans from the fact that apes can be trained to mimic humans in some respects. Language is a notorious failure, exactly as any biologist and paleoanthropologist would have expected. But if, say, Nim had succeeded, we would still have learned nothing about language acquisition, gaining neither more nor less wonderment, though we would have a biological problem. Namely, if apes have this fantastic capacity, surely a major component of humans' extraordinary biological success, then how come they haven't used it? It's as if humans can really fly, but won't know until some trainer comes along to teach them. Which is very interesting. It implies that the fact that no other animal comes to use this language communication mechanism which is clearly very helpful for us, right, in our as a species, proves that there's something more fundamental about it that they're not tapping into, right? If humans, like the example he gives, like, what if humans could fly, but we wouldn't know until a special trainer came along to teach us? As he says, we would have a biological problem on our hands if Nim Chimpsky could reproduce human speech, right? But furthermore, it wouldn't resolve the other thing. Why would they not have developed this, right? Why would they not have developed the linguistic capacity that humans use, and by using have become like one of the most successful the most successful species, the most epic, cool, kino species? Well, what that implies is that it's not just the biological element. As we've seen from Nim Chimpsky and others, the biological component is irreconcilable. Other animals don't come close. But even if they did, it wouldn't resolve the social issue. Why would they never have developed it? And that's where generative anthropology comes into play. Generative anthropology answers, off of decently biological grounds, that question with a really strong hypothesis, a virtually unchallenged hypothesis, about the origin of language, which Eric Gans talks about in his book, The Origin of Language. And basically what he says is, look at this capacity that humans have, mimesis. That's basically how we learn language. Mimesis, by the way, is mimicry and learning information about your environment, or learning behavior through mimicking other things, typically other creatures in your community. So language is clearly mimetic, right? We learn language by mimicking other animals in our community, but it's not just mimetic, right? There's something more to it than just mimicry. That is to say, there's kind of a matter of origin here. Why would animals never have done it if they could? And they can't, but even if they could, why would they never have done it? Well, that comes back to a discussion of origin and a particular kind of mimesis that Eric Gans and René Girard and Adam Katz and lots of really successful, interesting, well-respected, somewhat defrocked academics have proposed as the origin of human language, right? That is, take desire, right? René Girard proposed that all human desire is mimetic. Now, that's sort of hard to wrap your head around, but for an example, René Girard gives the circumstance of a kid in a library who holds a toy in his hand and raises it up. And by doing so, every other kid that sees this starts to want that specific toy. Not just any toy, but the toy that kid is holding up, right? And this is what he calls mimetic desire. You're mimicking another person's desire, and you can see how it leads to conflict. Now, humans are probably the strongest mimetic animal in the sense of mimicking other creatures within our own community. Not probably, excuse me. We are the most mimetic animal, the most strongly mimetic animal when it comes to mimicking other animals in our community. And what that means is mimetic desire is a particularly dangerous thing for us, right? Now, I'll bring this into the modern day in a second, but first let's look at the proposal that Eric Gans uses of how this mimetic desire could lead to human language. Again, not through mere mimesis, something to prove that there would be an original event, an originary event, that would be significant, right? That would give us a reason to have developed language that no other animal has as an impetus for them to develop language, answering Chomsky's social question. In the hypothetical circumstance where these animals could learn language, why would they not have? Well, this, proposed by Eric Gans, is essentially take that example of mimetic desire and transpose it onto a hypothetical proto-human community, right? This proto-human community, you could hypothesize gathering around an object of appetite, like an animal they've just killed and they need to eat, and you could hypothesize mimetic desire breaking out here. Everybody's, surrounding this animal, and they all want it, and they all know everybody else wants it. And they all know that if they grab it, everybody else is going to take that as a threat to the thing that they also want. And violence will break out because of that. Now, for that reason, nobody would really want to approach it. Nobody would approach it, but this desire keeps getting stronger and stronger, and therefore the tension that desire creates keeps getting stronger and stronger. So at some point, Eric Gans hypothesizes that in this liminal psychological state, one of these proto-humans sort of steps back, or emits some gesture that makes it very clear that they are not a threat, they're not about to take the food, and therefore by showing that gesture that they're aborting the attempt to appropriate the food. They're aborting that attempt to take the animal. they resolve a little bit of the mimetic tension. Everybody else sees and understands, because this is intuitive even to a lot of animals, that there is one less threat, that there is one less contributor to this mimetic desire and mimetic tension. And therefore, everybody else who also has a motive to reduce the threat of violence, that wants to reduce the tension and therefore defer violence, they all also step back. They all also emit this gesture of aborted appropriation. That's what Eric Gans calls it. And this is a pretty good suggestion for the first linguistic sign, because it's one of the few cases you could propose for a proto-human group that connects back into our biology through mimesis, and gives a circumstance where everybody's on the same page. Everybody's mind here is focused on the animal, and they all know that there's a degree of fear and tension and desire around this animal, around this this thing that they're all centered upon, that everybody else shares. They all have shared attentionality. Their attention is all on the same thing. And because they all also want to not destroy the community by breaking into violence, their intention is all on the same thing too. This is a special event that allows the attention, the shared attention of this object, it converts that into shared intention to resolve the violence, to defer the violence, and resolve the tension. And furthermore, this is an event you could foresee being relived several times. So this gesture could be relived whenever this circumstance of mimetic desire, of extreme mimetic tension comes about. Now, one could make a very obvious extrapolation from that event into modern nuclear warfare, for example, which is very interesting. Like, for example, everybody wants the spoils of war and everybody wants nuclear warheads, but as you appropriate those nuclear warheads, or as you threaten to, you endanger the destruction of the entire human community. And a very interesting analysis could be made about that. But for now, we're focusing on the origin of language, and this suggestion is actually pretty strong. I mean, it resolves all the issues of someone like Noam Chomsky, who believes that language in humans basically just came about because we're smart apes, and smart apes, for some reason, want language. It shows how we convert attention to intention. It resolves all these problems very cleanly, and using a strong enough biological and social basis that we know would have been present in these proto-human primates, that it feels too feasible not to be true, at least to some extent. So we've sort of gotten here unintentionally through Noam Chomsky's latter quote that I quoted, but basically there's two halves to the answer of how human language is different. On the one hand, we know that no animal can get close to it. We know that no animal can mimic our language, or can even mimic the syntax that our language is predicated upon, because we've tried it so many times with every animal that would be a good candidate for it, and it never turns out to be even close. Nim Chimpsky did convince us for a moment, but he was just dabbing on the researchers. He was outsmarting the academics. It's so funny that these academics, these really well-educated people, the best in the field, got outsmarted by a great ape. I think that's kind of a fun story. But anyway, so we know that they don't have the biological component. We know that we have a biological language faculty. We know that part of all human language is productivity and recursion. And we know that no animal language has productivity or recursion, and the fact that no animal can learn our language, even on a primitive scale, even on a very rudimentary level, a very elementary level, implies that that recursion is not just significant of productivity. It's significant of a whole paradigmatic structural shift that our language faculty has. That is, we didn't just develop language as a branch off from this prior animal communication faculty that chimps and other primates had, but instead we developed a totally novel form of language. And furthermore, to show that we developed it, to show a good, plausible circumstance of us developing it, we answer Chomsky's social question. Even if biologically it was feasible for other animals to produce this language, why would they never have done it? And the answer that a Girardian or that a generative anthropologist would give is that there was never that circumstance of extreme mimetic desire for these proto-human primates. The level of mimesis that humans have is really, really unique, and that is biologically ingrained. Your mimesis, it's pretty much in your genes. You can't really be taught to be more or less mimetic. You can in some circumstances, but you can't be taught to censor that fundamental mimetic instinct that all humans, and furthermore, a lot of social animals have. We just have it much more strongly, which explains why that originary event would apply exclusively to humans. So we've answered the question on two fronts. On the one hand, our language faculty permits for productivity and recursion. We know animals don't do that. And furthermore, we know that they can't do that. And then we get to the social element. They don't have mimesis like we do. They don't have that mimetic origin point that we very likely did. So anyway, I got kind of too involved in the academic stuff there for a moment. This all comes to dabbing on idiots, on obnoxious people. We're not dabbing on. This is a PSA. This is educating people. Okay, we are educating people in this PSA. That's some of the most obnoxious terminology I could have used. But yeah, this all comes back to that big misconception that, well, animal language has the word language in it, so when you're talking about the origin of language, we should look to our primate ancestors, or birds, or something like that. I think that may actually be the main issue, that we call bird language or chimp language or orca language instead of animal signing or animal communication. And so people who have a passing interest or rudimentary knowledge in those things will kind of be like, oh, well, human language must have some connection to them. They must be reconcilable. They're not. We proved they're not because we're kings, because I'm a king. We are kings, though, all of us. You know, kings recognize kings. Anyway, guys, this has been a kind of long video to cover a pretty simple topic. If you ever hear someone say this about human language, you can shut them down now. It's your responsibility to shut them down. But cheers, guys. Have a good one. It's been epic.